Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I'd like to talk briefly on the topic of the Montessori method in homeschooling. For me, this is a strange question, whether the Montessori method is appropriate for homeschooling. But I'd like to talk about it a little bit because I know that many parents are aware of the Montessori method, and it's popular, and people love to talk about these different styles or methods of education. And I'd like to answer the question whether or not Montessori method is something that should be of interest to homeschool parents. I'll admit that I don't know the details of the practical outworkings of the Montessori method. But what I do know is the historical context in which it was developed, the purpose for which it was developed, and I think those are helpful for us to consider whether Montessori education in a homeschool environment really makes any sense. And in fact, I think that it leads us to an interesting consideration, which I'll talk about. When we go back into history, we look at the dawn of the modern industrial society back to the mid to late 1800s, early 1900s. And what was in vogue at the time was this industrialized vision of a brave new world where science and technology we're going to redesign everything and organize the world so that men can draw from the natural world its full potential and enjoy a prosperous life in a world that was never possible before. That was the idea of the industrial era. Of course, there was a lot of money to be made, but let's just give the benefit of the doubt to those who say that the men who pursued those ideas were interested in advancing human society. What was done, and it's very easy for us to think about this, by looking at business and just using the automobile industry as the sign or symbol of this period. The great breakthrough, of course, was the assembly line, when Henry Ford developed this system of manufacturing automobiles where, rather than having a master worker work for days and days or even weeks to produce one product completely, the entire process was broken down into bite-sized pieces so that a team of men, an assembly line of men, focusing on one specific piece, would together manufacture thousands and thousands of vehicles, each man focusing on one specific task. And because such a quantity of vehicles was able to be produced and there was so much demand for these vehicles, there would be tons of revenue possible. That revenue would be able to pay the men far more than they would ever be able to make in previous occupations, and not only would automobile technology and travel be advanced, but the quality of life would be improved by greater wages for assembly line work. This idea of the efficient system, the division of labor, efficiency studies, this was what was in vogue at the time. And as the desire for American public education and the same desire in other industrializing countries developed, it developed in the context of this industrialism, this idea of efficiency and the division of labor and the assembly line method of manufacturing. And men thought that this same model would be a good idea for school use. we can divide the education of a child up into bite-sized pieces, just like the manufacturing of an automobile. And once we've divided up that education into pieces, we can spread it out across this assembly line of education, and then we can hire specialists to focus on each piece of this education, and we can mass educate human society. Sounded like an intriguing idea, but of course, human beings are nothing like automobiles, and we're not merely installing parts in education. And so there were objectors to this idea of turning the school systems into assembly lines. And the argument was that children can't be taken away from their families, away from this natural environment, and treated like soulless, nameless, faceless products on an assembly line. That's not healthy. We can't allow that to happen. One of the objectors, one of the opponents, was Maria Montessori. And Montessori argued that young children, because the Montessori method is really focused on young children, are naturally best educated in a family or home environment where they have this sort of organic role to play within the family. And if they're taken out of that family and put into this modern assembly line culture, it's not going to be good for their development. And what Maria Montessori proposed was that early education be sort of a bridge between the home, the nursery, and the school. That early elementary be sort of well, I guess a bridge really is the best way to think of it. It's sort of a more natural, social, comfortable environment for a young child, but it also is moving towards the more formal nature of the assembly line type modern school. And so the idea was to have the children do things at school that are comparable to things that they would do at home. Even though it was artificial, it was still in some way natural. And that was the purpose of the Montessori method of education. Now, having said all that, we consider the question of whether the Montessori method is appropriate for homeschooling. And this should make us scratch our heads. If those children are not going to the school, but are staying home, why in the world would the Montessori method be necessary? They're home. Why would we need activities and resources that are modeled after the real things if the kids are actually in the real home environment? It makes no sense that the Montessori method would be necessary in the home environment. But I think that there's a reason why parents find this interesting. The assumption in this industrialized school culture, and this goes back, let's go to the 1920s when John Dewey was writing. And I talk about this in detail in the book that I published, Understanding Classical Catholic Education. It's towards the end, obviously, dealing with modern American schools, but John Dewey had an idea that for a democratic society to flourish, the old medieval local economy and family culture had to be sacrificed for the sake of the new nationalized or even globalized democratic culture. We see this continuing today in liberal politics where they pursue globalization. And they do it at the expense of local concerns. That's why, when someone like Donald Trump runs for president, he runs with an America First motto. And the alternative is this more globalized view of the economy and human society. We see this is still an issue a century later, today in 2022. But this issue was developing when America was founded, and the nation, because this was a time of nationalism, not yet globalization. But nationalism was strong at this time. This was right in the midst of the First World War, and this nationalistic attitude between the nations. But Dewey believed that children need to be separated from their families and dedicated to the service of their country. That the country, the democratic society, was more important and was a greater priority than the family and the local society. And so the idea of democracy in education, which is a book that John Dewey wrote, was to get these children out of this family-minded culture, this local culture, and turn their attention to this national society, this democratic culture, and that school was the means by which this transformation was to take place. It was to be pursued through the schools. And so the child needed to be taken away from this natural, local, domestic environment and moved into the modern democratic school environment. Well, that was developing in the 1920s, and the whole public school system emerged from that movement, separating the family from the school. Now, what happens is when parents choose to homeschool, most of them have been educated in this modern school system. This is how they think of school. And they really can't think of anything outside of this modern K-12 assembly line democratic school system. They can't think of anything outside of that system unless they put on Little House on the Prairie and think about a one-room schoolhouse, which is still a modern education. It's just that, the one-room schoolhouse was useful in areas where there weren't many children, and the children would simply be gathered together for school, and the teacher there would do as much as she could. Whatever she could do was considered better than nothing. But the school, the K-12 school, developed in more populated areas where there were hundreds and hundreds of kids, and a whole school, grade level school, could be developed. Most homeschooling parents have been educated in that environment with that curriculum, with that mentality, and when they think about homeschooling, they usually think about getting away from some of the superficial problems in a modern school. Let's say it has a liberal political agenda, or it has sort of an anti-Christian moral perspective, or it doesn't respect religion, or the student body will have a bad influence on my children. There are drugs and fights in the school, and I don't want my children dealing with those things. Usually those are the kinds of things that motivate parents to consider homeschooling. But the problem is that when they consider that move to homeschooling, they simply bring the modern school with them from the school environment into the home. And the home school becomes this school at home, which is not what homeschooling should be. This is artificial. This is itself just continuing this modern error of assembly line schooling for children. And so what happens is these parents who have come from this modern educational background and can't think of education outside of this model, they're not really happy with this artificial assembly line school model being brought home. And so they think, I'm going to think outside the box. I'm going to do something radical and different. And when they look around at options, they find the Montessori method, and they think, that makes more sense. This is sort of a natural model. The children do activities that are more natural and family-centered. But what they can't even seem to grasp is that the children are home. There's no reason to have a Montessori method at home. The problem, again, because they've been raised in this modern democratic society, this modern industrialized society, is the home life is not what traditional home life was like. The home life has been redesigned by this modern culture. And so the home life itself is not present for the child. Homeschooling becomes modern schooling at home, and the Montessori method is considered to be an alternative to the modern schooling at home, which is why we talk about Montessori methods in homeschooling. But again, this makes no sense. Now, what's really happening here is that we're being challenged as families and parents. We're being challenged to not merely bring our children back home from the school. We're being challenged to restore traditional family life. That's the real challenge. And many homeschooling parents don't know what traditional family life is. And homeschooling simply means having school at home. In a family environment, that's not what the traditional family environment was like. In the traditional family environment, the economy itself was local. The economy was local. The businesses, the entire process by which the necessities of life were produced was local. Kids could see the whole process, from the plowing of the fields to the making of the tools. Every part of the process by which the needs of life were produced were local and accessible from home. That was the real difference. So homeschooling families struggle to restore a traditional family life and have this sort of artificial modern household where the home is really just what we call a bedroom. They're called bedroom communities, these neighborhoods where really all people do there is sleep. They don't work there. There's no local business. There's no local economy. Everything is purchased from abroad and brought into the house. The Amazon Prime trucks are running up and down the road all day long, delivering all the products whose origins are unseen. The traditional family life is not present. And that's why that challenge in homeschooling exists, where the parents can feel like something is wrong. And instead of realizing that the traditional family culture is still not present, even though the family may be Christian, even though they may be open to homeschooling, that traditional family life, that localized culture is not present. And Montessori method homeschool materials become an interest. And it's sort of weird, in my opinion, because it's a sign that something is wrong, and then it's settling for some artificial product or method intended for a modern school that's now being used in the home, where the reality of those activities and resources which are produced and used in the Montessori method school are supposed to exist in their natural form. It's a strange situation, but I would argue that the Montessori method is not the solution. If you're concerned about modern culture, and if you want to restore traditional family life, and you want to bring your children back from this modern educational culture to traditional family life, you have to go beyond just choosing another curriculum that is sort of a middle-of-the-road step between family life and school life. You've got to go back and consider restoring traditional family life. And if you restore traditional family life, you won't need to use any Montessori method, because you'll have the reality of that family life rather than this artificial substitute for family life, which is what the Montessori method was designed to be. So interest in the Montessori method is a good sign, because it's a sign that the parents feel that something about the modern school culture isn't right. They're willing to go back. They're willing to change. They're willing to step out of this line of people all moving in the same direction. They're willing to take upon themselves the challenge of doing something different, something better. But what they choose is not going far enough, not going to the real cause of the trouble, not solving the real problem. And I think long term, they're just going to be back at square one asking the same questions because they haven't addressed the real problem. So if you're thinking about or talking about or learning about the Montessori method in education, what I advise is that you not get lost in the details, lost in the catalogs, lost in all the cool stuff that's available, or the sort of esoteric, Montessori language and strategies and methods that are talked about. Before you get lost in all of that curious detail, take some time to think about the original context of the development of the Montessori method, the intended purpose of the Montessori method, and ask whether or not that actually is true of your situation, or whether you're settling for a solution that was intended for a modern school, not a home, not a family. And then consider what you need to do to go beyond that, to the actual cause of the problem, and actually work to restore the traditional family culture, which is what has been abandoned and is largely lost today, and may be what our children need. I hope that's helpful. God bless.